Bu akşam Brookings Enstitüsü stüdyosuna bağlanacağız. Ekonomist Homi Kharas G-20 zirvesini yorumlayacak. Welcome, Mr. Kharas, to our studio. We appreciate your participating in our program.
Thank you for having me.
Teşekkür ederim beni ağırladığınız için.
Can you hear me?
Şimdi beni
Yes, very well.
Mr. Kharas?
Çok iyi duyabiliyorum.
The G-20 countries represent 85% of the world economy and 2/3 of the global population. The global economic crisis has affected developing countries very badly. The African Development Bank called on the group of G-20 just before the summit to provide it with more funds to help reduce the impact of the global economic crisis and urged G-20 leaders not to forget the continent and other low-income countries. What is the G-20 doing for low-income countries?
Well, at the moment, unfortunately, I don't think that they're doing very much for low-income countries at all. The principal thing that the G20 has done is they have given many more resources to the IMF to try to help developing countries, but most of those resources have gone to the emerging market economies, especially in Eastern Europe, to stabilize their economies. The concessional funds, the money that go to low-income African countries, really have not been increased at all.
Ama yine de bu giden fonların henüz artırıldığını söyleyemeyiz.
World Bank President said that the world needs a crisis response facility to ensure that quick and effective assistance can be provided to the most vulnerable low-income countries following severe and widespread shocks. How likely is it for the G20 leaders to agree on any assistance plan for the establishment of such a facility?
That doesn't really seem to be on the short-term agenda of the G20 right now. The big issues in the G20 are on financial sector regulation, treatment of bankers' pay, capital requirements. They are looking towards the big issues that affect the global economy. What's happening, I feel, is that the low-income countries, because they don't really have a very large impact on the global economy, their economies are actually quite small because they're poor, don't get the same kind of attention. So even though I think that there is a consensus that everybody agrees that the low-income countries are suffering considerably during this crisis, the willingness to provide concessional financing to help them through a crisis facility is just not there. At the same time, it's easy to talk about a general crisis facility, but even if the money was there, in many countries they simply don't have the safety net mechanisms to allow this money to be disbursed very rapidly. So those systems also need to be built up. Some kind of a global crisis safety net may well be a long-run proposition, but doesn't seem to be an immediate outcome of the current G20 talks. Now, the G20 has been talking a lot about a sustainable recovery, and I hope that as they think about a sustainable recovery, they go beyond what it is currently meaning, which is simply how do we get Asia to save less and spend more, and how do we get the US to save more and spend less? That's the big imbalance in the global economy today. But I hope that the G20 will also go a step further and ask the question, how do we make sure that some of the 2 billion people who are living in very vulnerable countries also participate in the global economy and are protected from the ups and downs.
Are the World Bank, IMF and the regional development banks providing enough help to developing countries build productivity, investment, sources of energy, all linked to regional and global trade, do you think?
Well, I think they've done a very good job during this crisis of protecting the middle-income developing countries. There, the IMF has been given additional resources, it's made it available, it's reduced the conditionality on its lending to allow countries which already had good investment projects on their books to continue with these projects. The World Bank has rapidly increased its lending to middle-income countries. So there has been a really effective intervention to make sure that public investment doesn't suffer too much, to make sure that education and health don't suffer too much. It's in the low-income countries where the risks are far greater, that there may be an interruption in development momentum. And that's because neither the World Bank nor the IMF have received significant increases in concessional resources that they can make available to low-income countries. So low-income countries are proceeding with a resource envelope that is almost exactly the same as it was before the crisis. And yet, as we all know, thanks to the crisis, their needs have expanded enormously.
The finance ministers and central bank governors of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the so-called BRIC countries, a couple of weeks ago called on the G20 countries to maintain stimulus measures to promote financial stability and economic growth. Will the G20 countries be able to do this and also establish some kind of a coordination among themselves?
I think so. I think that one of the real successes of the G20 has been that they have been able to generate a coordinated approach to in response to the crisis. And that coordinated approach has really been by an informal process. Every country has done its own bit according to what it sees its own needs are. But working together, when you add it all up, it has added up to a very significant stimulus to the global economy. So I think it's good news that today the G20 is still talking about the need to maintain this stimulus and not to exit too quickly. There is a great deal of concern, especially in rich countries, that the debt which is piling up on the government's books is getting too big. And there is therefore a push to have governments draw back. But we know from experience that if they do that too quickly, the recovery can be snuffed out. It's imperative that the stimulus be maintained for long enough so that private sector demand can come in to replace it when public expenditure starts to be withdrawn. So I think that the G20 has done a very good job so far of being able to talk through these issues and bring people to view the world through a common lens. And by viewing the world through a common lens, it's generated coordination among different countries, even without having any formal coordination mechanisms or coordination teeth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kharas, for participating in our program.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Brookings Enstitüsü'nden ekonomist Homi Kharas, ekonomik krizden en çok zarar gören ülkeler için G20'lerin yapması gerekenleri anlattı.